I got my body and my mind on the same page, and honey, now happiness is all the rage. I got my body and my mind on the same page, and honey, now happiness is all the rage.
Hello and welcome, this is your Brain on Drugs, and this is Punk Rock Psychiatrist. So today, moving through in chronological order of our atypical antidepressants, we're going to cover the serotonin, the so-called serotonin modulators and stimulators. This is a name that I had not heard until a couple of weeks ago when I was working on this episode. This includes the two medications, Vilazodone and Vortioxetine. These are basically SSRIs with some different added interactions at serotonin receptors. So I suppose they've been dubbed the serotonin modulators and stimulators. And the first one of them that came out was Vilazodone, brand name Viibryd, 2012. So this was right as I was coming into my intern year. And because of that, I haven't really seen it or used it. I don't think I've ever given this to a patient. I believe I have had a few patients that came onto the inpatient unit that have been started on this in an outpatient clinic. So how does it work? So like I said, it's kind of like an SSRI plus a 5-HT1A partial agonist. I think of it kind of like a mix between Buspar and escitalopram or buspirone. So because you've got your SSRI quality, you've got like a clean SSRI, something like an escitalopram, and then you've got kind of that buspirone 5-HT1A partial agonist. We haven't talked about that yet because it's an anxiolytic is what it's FDA approved for. So we will get to that when we talk about anxiety medications. But it kind of comes up here. And, you may be wondering, what was the purpose of trying to get this medication to have this 5-HT1A partial agonist added onto it? Well, first, perhaps, this is adding some anxiolytic effect. And then when you look at one of the newer medications that we're going to talk about in a couple episodes from now, Gepirone, it's actually a 5-HT1A partial agonist, and it has been approved as an antidepressant. So there may be some antidepressant qualities of 5-HT1A partial agonism. There may be some anxiolytic effects. So some, your SSRIs are doing antidepressant anxiolytic effects, and then the 5-HT1A, which is really something that they're also doing. Because remember, we're increasing serotonin when we block the reuptake of the serotonin pump. And with more serotonin, there's more serotonin to interact with the 5-HT1A receptor in addition to the other receptors. So this is just kind of boosting that a little bit more, perhaps. And I guess this is why maybe they're called serotonin modulators. They're kind of modulating it, right? And we've got that partial agonist action going on, which is a little bit different than a full agonist. So I don't know if I've gone into this yet. I'm going to have a whole lecture series on kind of how medications work in general. And we're going to talk about things like antagonist, agonist, partial agonist. But the way I think about this is a full agonist, you're basically acting like the substance that you're replacing. So serotonin is the full agonist at the serotonin receptors. And so if you've made a medication that's also a full agonist, it's basically acting just as serotonin would at that particular receptor. And then an antagonist basically locks onto the receptor and it prevents the full agonist, in this case serotonin, from getting to the receptor. And then a partial agonist, it does kind of a so-so job. It doesn't work quite as well as a full agonist. And, depending on how tightly it binds to the receptor, depending on what the levels are, it could have if in the presence of a lot of serotonin, in this case, we're talking about a serotonin receptor. In the presence of a lot of serotonin, it's going to kind of act like an antagonist because it's it's not quite lighting up that receptor, activating it as strongly as serotonin would. It's not fitting in and twisting it and manipulating it and making it kind of fire the way we want it to if it was a full agonist. But because it's maybe locking on a little bit tighter than serotonin would, it's preventing the full agonist from getting on, right? So in the presence of a lot of serotonin, in many ways it's starting to act like an antagonist. And then in the presence of not very much serotonin, it would actually have more of an agonist effect, because since there's no serotonin around, and even though this isn't working as well as serotonin would be, it's doing something, right? And that's kind of how I think about the partial agonist, right? So if the full agonist is tons of it around, it basically blocks it from doing anything. And if there's not that much around, you're getting more effect. And in a sense, it's causing the same effect either way, but it's just, whether there's a lot of the full agonist around or not kind of makes it act more or less like an antagonist or an agonist. So that's that's where this modulator, serotonin modulator, comes in. So it's kind of modulating the 5-HT1A. Kind of, are we turning it up a little bit? Are we turning it down a little bit? That's how that works. And so that may be having some anxiolytic effects. And then there's also this idea that there could be an improvement in sexual side effects. Sometimes, we talked about the sexual side effects several episodes ago. I mentioned that buspirone is something that's sometimes added to help with those SSRI-induced sexual dysfunction. And I have seen this done. I've seen it work. I hear more about it working and that it can work. And oh no, this not only does this not cause, like, something like buspirone doesn't cause sexual side effects because it only affects 5-HT1A, but it can actually improve things and sometimes is added to an SSRI to help with that. And so I think what they kind of the idea here with vilazodone was, well, we want, one of the things we hate about SSRIs so much are these sexual side effects. And if we can have that 5-HT1A ability added onto an SSRI, then maybe we mitigate that a little bit, right? I mean, of course, we could always just add buspirone if we wanted this effect. I never understand why, when these medications come out, they cost hundreds of dollars. Sometimes they cost like $100 a pill. It's absolutely insane, right? They cost 10, 20 times more than the stuff that's off patent. And it's like, so it's worth 10 to 20 times more to give somebody a single pill instead of 2 pills. I don't buy it. Like, it's not that big of a deal to take one extra pill. It's not like the one extra pill is causing some sort of terrible side effect or interaction or something like that we're trying to mitigate. Or, oh, you're taking too much medicine. No. The one pill is basically equivalent to taking the 2 pills. And if the 2 pills cost 10 to 20 times less, sometimes even more, why wouldn't you just take, is it that inconvenient to take an extra pill? I guess, also with buspirone, we often dose it 2 to 3 times a day. And with this, you're dosing it once a day. So perhaps you are taking 1 pill instead of 3 or 4, right? But still, is it really worth saving? Is it really worth spending that much more money in our healthcare system to add virtually no benefit, just a tiny bit of convenience? I think if patients were paying out of pocket and I told them, you can take 2 to 4 pills and I'll charge you $1, or you can take 1 and I'll charge you $20, and you have to take these every single day. So essentially you're spending $19 a day so that you have to swallow a couple of less pills. I don't think there would be very many people anyone who didn't have like an infinite amount of money, like, why would you throw away 19 extra dollars just to not swallow a couple extra pills? It's really not worth it. So as you can see, my opinion of vilazodone is not very good, but it improves. So, give me a minute. This medication is indicated for major depression alone. All right. Let's talk a little bit about pharmacokinetics. Cmax is reached within 4 to 5 hours. And a big one here is that food does affect bioavailability. This is one of the few psychiatric medications where food really comes into play. Now, some other ones, I think about lorazepam and ziprasidone, the antipsychotics. Um, I think about it, and even we're going to get to gepirone. I actually learned this today as I was working on the gepirone episode. Gepirone has effect from food, and vilazodone, right? Those are kind of the four. Um, Quetiapine has some effect. It's not like you have to do a certain way. I think risperidone as well, but with these four, you really have to eat on the pill if you want to expect the results that we're looking for. Okay, so with food, you're getting 72% of the dose. You get a decrease of around 50% without food. So if you don't take it with food, you're basically taking half a dose. That is, and then we can't control it as well. And the way the drug manufacturers come up with is they said that the way they've tested it and the way that they're asking you to prescribe it and all the stuff that they put in there about it is on the assumption that the patient is eating with it. And so if they're not eating with it, then we just can't measure a lot of this stuff quite well. We just don't have the control. So really, you've got to eat on this. And that is a big downside because what if the person's not eating at the particular time that they take the pill? So they have to, not only do they have to remember to take the pill around the same time every day, they also have to remember to eat at around the same time every day and at the same time as the pill. And the more variables that we add into the equation, patients do not do things consistently. They're not taking their pills every day to begin with. And now we're throwing on top of that, you have to eat on it. And, are they eating enough on it? With lorazepam and ziprasidone, we've got kilocalorie, amounts that you have to consume. With lorazepam, it's 250. With ziprasidone, it's 500. And ziprasidone is often dosed twice a day, so you would have to take 500 calories twice a day with it. We're not even given a calorie amount. Sometimes it's that you need to take it with a fatty meal, but there's nothing really here. It just says with food. So I'm not really sure how much food. I'm not sure what kind of food. It just says with food. So that's another not great thing. It's highly protein bound, 96 to 99%. That doesn't really have any, sometimes things that are highly protein bound, we have issues when we're taking them with things like aspirin and warfarin. But as far as I'm aware, that's not an issue here. It's extensively metabolized by the liver by several enzymes. So we've got 3A4, 2C19, and 2D6. This can cause some issues because now if we're inhibiting different enzymes, we're affecting its metabolism by lots of different medications rather than just a few inhibitors. And then its half-life is 25 hours, which is pretty standard for the SSRIs. Adverse effects, as expected, about the same as an SSRI because it's just basically an SSRI. And 5-HT1A agonism doesn't really convey a whole lot of adverse effects, and in particular, it doesn't really have any adverse effects that you don't already have with an SSRI. So most commonly nausea, diarrhea, headache, and the other type of serotonin side effects. As far as pregnancy, there's not much information, and I'm gonna go into pregnancy. That's going to be a whole episode. What medications are recommended and so forth. And generally, the older the medication, the more data we have and the more recommendations we have. And this is a newer med. It's 12 years ago now, or I guess it's 2015, or sorry, it's 2025. So it's now about 13 years since Vilazodone came out, but still relatively one of our newer meds. And we've got a bunch of other ones we have a lot more information on. So there hasn't really been a lot of statements on, is this okay to take in pregnancy or not? So limited information there. And then as far as drug interactions, as I mentioned, it's got a lot of CYP stuff going on. So strong inhibitors of 2D6 can increase vilazodone, like bupropion would be an example. Strong inducers of CYP enzymes can decrease vilazodone. So, and remember, it's metabolized by 3 different enzymes. So inducers of many different things. So this is things like carbamazepine, phenytoin can decrease vilazodone. It's once again contraindicated with MAOI, as it is basically an SSRI. And then, as I said, the protein binding interactions, even though it's highly protein bound, no significant interactions there, really. And then, as far as CYP inhibitions, as I previously mentioned, this is one of a handful, 4 or 5 different meds that does not have any inhibition of any CYP enzymes. So that's a plus. How to dose it? The dosing is a little different than our other antidepressants. Generally, with the other ones, you have a starting dose and you adjust it in 4 to 6 weeks. I usually have them start half the dose for a week and then go up and adjust it in 4 to 6 weeks. With this one, it's much more specific. Specific. Recommended dose is 40 milligrams. 20 milligrams if they're on a strong 3A4 inhibitor. So some medications have dosing adjustments if they're taken with an inhibitor. Some just say caution. This one actually says if they're taking a strong 3A4 inhibitor. And remember, grapefruit juice is a strong 3A4 inhibitor. So once again, not great to use meds that are metabolized by 3A4 because of there's some other foods. There's Seville oranges, grapefruits, and I mean these are grapefruit's a common it's a commonly consumed food, and there's just a lot of 3A4 is just very vulnerable. So they're on a strong 3A4 inhibitor, and you'll have to tell them no grapefruit juice. They'll have to take the half dose of 20 milligrams. And, I think there's other meds out there that maybe you would give them that warning and say, hey, don't have grapefruit juice with this. But in this case, it's like, let's just prescribe something else. Like, is vilazodone really that spectacular? No. Its ability to work is about the same as any of our other antidepressants. And generally how like I said, we have several of them that are very similar. And then you've got qualities like, oh, is it causing a lot of QT prolongation? Well, let's not use that one. Oh, does it have like a really weird half-life, like an ultra short half-life or an ultra long half-life? Or does it have some anticholinergic properties? And I just kind of throw those to the bottom of the list. And, vilazodone, I'm throwing you to the bottom of the list because this, affected by food, affected by 3A4 inhibitors. I mean, these are just adding complications in there that we don't really want to deal with. And now I've got to tell the patient, if don't drink grapefruit juice on this med. There's pretty much no other antidepressants. I don't think we've talked about any antidepressants that are metabolized by 3A4. Most of them are 2D6, 2C19, 2B6. So most of them we don't deal with this 3A4. With this one we do. And so that becomes kind of an issue. And so this is how you dose it: 10 milligrams for 7 days, 20 milligrams for 7 days, 40 milligrams. So instead of your standard kind of monthly up titration, the manufacturers recommended this increasing like every 7 days. So you're going to have to give them 3 scripts at your first appointment: a 7-day supply of 10, a 7-day supply of 20, and then I guess maybe a 14-day supply of 40 so that you see them in a month. That's kind of a pain, and it doesn't really give a lot of room to play around with the dose. It's like, oh no, 40 is the dose, unless they're on a 3A4 inhibitor. 40 is the dose, get them up to 40, that's your dose. The new antipsychotic lumateperone has the same issue where 42 milligrams is like the only dose that we can use. That's a downside. I don't like that. You could, of course, change the dose after they get up to 40. But I mean, if they're having you get up to 40, are you even going to think about going back down to 20? Usually I like to start low, see how it works. And if we don't need more, don't add more. But the way this is kind of written, maybe you could do that on your own. You could say, yeah, I mean, you don't have to go up to 40 in 2 weeks. But once again, I never prescribed this. So if I had prescribed this 50 times, I'd tell you how I did it. But I don't prescribe it. And so I can't really give you much of a recommendation there. Like I said, I would probably just give them a different SSRI. If I wanted what Vilazodone did, I might add buspirone on there. I'm not a huge buspirone fan. I know people that are, but most of the patients I see on buspirone had not noticed any difference. And these are ones I inherited from somebody else. Said, have you noticed anything since you started this? No. And then we stop it. Did you notice anything? No. So you're getting kind of that with this too. All right. And so, once again, we're still talking about dosing. Take with food. I've already mentioned this. Administration without food results in inadequate drug concentrations and may diminish effectiveness. And then there's a recommendation when discontinuing, reduce dose gradually. I mean, I do that with all medications, but that is actually specifically written in the package insert for this medication. So I added it. So let's talk about what I like and what I don't like about Vilazodone. Let's go over the advantages and disadvantages. So advantages, we've got that 5-HT1A partial agonism. That's something that's different, okay? It's something that didn't exist with our other SSRIs. So what might we get out of that? So we might have the lower sexual side effect risk. There's potential for that. But once again, bupropion has no sexual side effects risk. So that's even a better option because this is still an SSRI. So we're still going to get sexual side effects. Maybe the 1A added on can diminish that a little bit. But if we just use bupropion, we don't have that problem at all. And then vortioxetine I have is also a little bit better with its sexual side effect risk. So it also has 5-HT1A. We're about to talk about that one, but apparently vortioxetine's sexual side effect risk is a little bit less than Vilazodone's. However, bupropion's is like nothing. Mirtazopine's is pretty much nothing. So there are other options if you're trying to avoid that. It may have lower weight gain risk, and then there might be this potential benefit for anxiety. Though the effect size for this, and I'm going to go over the effect size for all the medications once we finish them, it's actually lower than the other SSRIs. So the effects, I mean, they're all fairly similar, but it is on the lower end of effectiveness, and vortioxetine is as well. So another reason these are not two meds that I'm all that thrilled about, because they came out, they're like, hey, we counteract all these adverse effects from SSRIs. You should use these instead of the SSRIs. But then it turns out, do they really? And then they don't even seem to work as well. So that's a downside. And then once again, like I said, if you wanted this 1A benefit, you could just add buspirone. Okay. So that's the advantage of having the 1A. And then number 2, we don't have the CYP inhibition. We love that. That's great. And then the last advantage I have is that the patent actually expired in June 2022. So it's become cheaper. So maybe before you were thinking, oh, I could just add buspirone on top of it. But now it's like, well, maybe I can just give them Vilazodone because it's not that expensive anymore. So something to think about, right? So now it's like, okay, well, maybe I would consider it. But at the same time, when you think about buspirone has a metabolite, 1-PP, which has alpha-2 antagonist qualities, which is similar to what mirtazapine does, which may have some, increases in serotonin and norepinephrine. So you might actually be getting a little bit of extra with buspirone that you're not getting with Vilazodone. So it has just the 1A partial agonism that buspirone has, but it does not have the alpha-2 antagonism. And also there's some D3 and D4 and a little bit of D2 activity from buspirone. So we're actually getting a little bit more with buspirone than we would be getting with vilazodone. So the combo buspirone with an SSRI may actually give us a little bit more. And so still a reason to kind of think about that combo. All right. Let's go over the disadvantages. I've already mentioned these. Must be taken with food. I've, told you what I think about that and how that affects compliance. That's not great. It may be slightly worse with GI adverse effects than other SSRIs. Also not good because GI adverse effects on SSRIs is quite frequent. We're talking 25 to 33%. And if this is a little bit on the worst side, then that's not great either. Next, like I said, there's no good evidence that there's improved efficacy. In fact, the effect size is lower. And there's no evidence that it's more tolerated than other antidepressants. So that's not great. And then lastly, the sensitivity to 3A4 inhibitors and inducers, that I don't care for. I already, I went over that. So the fact that we have to change the dose for that there's so many 3A4 inhibitors, that grapefruit juice is one of them. I mean, half meds are 3A4, but like it'd be nice to use one that's not 3A4, and most of the other antidepressants, if not almost all of them, aren't. And so that's a downside. And then also I would throw in there the whole dosing schedule of like basically 40 is your dose and that's your dose. And then the fact that you have to remember to lower it to 20 if they're on a 3A4 inhibitor that you may not even have given them, right? So maybe you're giving them 40, you don't even know they're on a 3A4 inhibitor and they're supposed to be on 20 now. Just a lot of complications for not any benefit. Like that's the bottom line here. We've got a number of complications with drug interactions, and these are things that we are not dealing with the other antidepressants. We've got no improved efficacy, no improved tolerability. This potential benefit on sexual side effects is more theoretical. Like I've looked to see if this is even real. Like if you look into Buspar, there are some studies that like show that it can help with that, but there isn't anything for vilazodone really. There's just the initial studies that the drug company did that showed that it had lower sexual side effect risk. But if you look at the initial studies of fluoxetine, it was like 1.8%. And so it went up over time. And so, I mean, how much can I trust the studies done by the drug company when they tried to get it approved? Those are so frequently biased that there's nothing else that's been done since then. There's no head-to-heads against other meds to say, oh, does this have less sexual side effects than another antidepressant? No, there's nothing about that. And then of course, if you put it against placebo would beat it because placebo doesn't cause sexual side effects. And so there's basically this one, basically the one theoretical benefit that this medication might have of having less sexual side effects. It's not even like they haven't even taken the time to really prove it, and the thing is, I feel like that's a big deal. Like if you had a med that had the same effects as an SSRI and didn't cause the sexual side effects, which is like 70% of people get, and it's really bothersome and really problematic. And as I've said in the past, I had patients that lost a relationship over it because she thought he was cheating. Like this could be huge, right? And really could make a lot of your mood gains go away if you've lost something that's important to you like that. If you had a med that could do that, wow, that would be an amazing medication, right? You think that you'd want to prove it. You'd want to put head-to-head trials against the most commonly prescribed medications. And remember our top 300 list? Vilazodone ain't on it. Okay, Vortioxetine ain't on it. All right. If these meds, they came out, like I said, about a decade ago, and if they were so great and if they were such big improvements over the SSRIs, then they would be on that list. And they're not, because we're not sold that they're better. There's not good evidence that they're better. And there's not even, like I said, there's not even good evidence that it's tolerated better. So, it's an option. It's out there. It isn't, I mean, it's just as likely to work probably than anything else. but and now it's off patent, so it's cheaper. But with these downsides, I would definitely go for sertraline before this. I would go for escitalopram before this. I would go for fluoxetine before this. I'd go with bupropion before this. I'd go for duloxetine before this. Heck, I might even go for venlafaxine before this, and you know how I feel about venlafaxine. Um, it, Vilazodone, I just think it's just kind of a loser. So it's not a horrible med, it's not a dangerous med, but it's just in a pile of meds that we could choose from, this is just not one that's going to be on the top. And I think like a lot of things, when it first came out, people prescribed it a lot. I saw it in like patients that would come on the inpatient unit, and I'd be like, why are they on this? And I never saw anything that impressed me. So moving on to the next med that doesn't impress me. You may think, why is he even doing these episodes? Well, I got to tell you about the meds I love and the meds I hate, and these are two of the meds that I don't care for. So vortioxetine came out in 2013, the next year. I remember I was in residency when this came out. It was originally called Trintellix, and for whatever reason got renamed Trintellix very shortly thereafter. Not really sure. I guess they thought Trintellix was. I don't know. Trintellix sounds harder to say than Trintellix. They're both stupid names. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. How does this work? So yeah, it like Vilazodone. It's an SSRI, and it's a 5-HT1A agonist. So the information I have on Vilazodone is that it's a 5-HT1A partial agonist, similar to buspirone and gepirone. But what I'm seeing for vortioxetine is that it's not a partial agonist, but it is an agonist. It may not be a full agonist. There is variability in the intrinsic activity on these receptors. So you may have anywhere between 0 to 100 on a scale of how much agonism, and perhaps 100 would be full agonist and a partial agonist would be somewhere in the middle. And then you can actually have more agonism than a full agonist. So my guess is this one is more of an agonist than Vilazodone, given where it's never mentioned as a partial agonist. And so perhaps that would allay to more of its effects on adverse sexual side effects. So, what I'd said when we were talking about Vilazodone was that vortioxetine was a little more effective as far as preventing those, and perhaps this might be an explanation for that. So we're getting some antidepressant effects, we're getting some maybe anxiolytic effects, and maybe the less sexual side effects. But what else is different? Well, it's also a 5-HT1B partial agonist, and they're kind of claiming that could have some antidepressant effects. I'm not really sure why. Sumatriptan is a partial agonist at this receptor, and it has no antidepressant qualities. 5-HT1D antagonist, they're claiming that may have some additional antidepressant effect. I mean, sumatriptan is an agonist at that, so I wonder, could this worsen migraines if it's an antagonist? That's kind of a question mark that I have. I'm not, like I said, I haven't seen it enough to really know, but I just kind of wonder, why do we need to be messing with 1B and 1D? What, was that just an accident when you made the med? Because I mean, generally, I don't really care about 1B and 1D. The next one kind of intrigues me. 5-HT3 antagonist, so may have lower GI adverse effects. So, if you had a patient that was getting most patients that get GI effects from these meds, from the SSRIs, typically improves over time. After a month, it's not too bad. But for some patients, it just keeps going on. And they love the antidepressant effect, but they hate the GI effects and they never get better. And it's like, what are you going to do? Put them on chronic ondansetron? I mean, you got to dose that 3-4 times a day. It's just not really reasonable. Here's a med that's got built-in 24-hour acting on ondansetron-like effect and is an SSRI. So, I might be considering it for this 3 antagonism, but at the same time, when you look at its side effect profile, it still causes GI adverse effects. So maybe they're less. But that's the one thing about this med that makes me, well, if I had that patient that had those GI effects on every other med, and that was the only thing stopping me from them getting better, then maybe I would give them this. So, but the next one is the one that the drug company wants you to think about. That's the other thing. The drug company doesn't really care about this 3 antagonism that I think is kind of the coolest part about it, because it's like, oh, anything that helps GI adverse effects and sexual side effects is something I'm interested in. And so helping those GI adverse effects, ooh, that intrigues me. But what they want you to think about is the 5-HT7 antagonism, because they say that helps with cognition. This is something that Vilazodone has, and they make this claim. And there's another one, I can't recall which one. I think there's another one that has 5-HT7 that, and if you look at the ads for this company, or for this medication, it's like walking out of the fog. Ooh, I walked out of the fog. I'm not having cognitive impairment. But when you actually examine like the one study that the drug company did when they got the drug approved, like the one that they did that where they measured this, it was like on like a huge scale of like 30 to 40 points or something like that, or 60 points. There was like 2 or 3 point reduction. So it's like, this is one of those things where it's like a statistically significant difference, but not a clinically impactful difference. However, that isn't to say that there aren't patients that might not get more of that. So I'm not going to completely write off vortioxetine's improved cognition, especially if you've got that patient that's so depressed that they're foggy and cognitively impaired. Concentration, the concentration piece of their depressive symptoms is one of their major ones. Consider it. Maybe this is a consideration for a patient like that. At the same time, this is going to be on patent until like 2031 or something like that. So for the mild benefit that they might get when I have like 10 other medications to choose from, do I want to spend 10 to 20 times on this patient for a med that is probably not going to make that much more of a difference? Probably not. Okay, but I will throw it out there that the 3 antagonism is intriguing to me, and the 7 antagonism, while I'm not that sold on it, it's something that I'm not going to completely write off. And this is another med that's only approved for major depression. So looking at its pharmacokinetics, Cmax is 7 to 11 hours. Food does not affect its bioavailability. It's also highly protein bound. And it's also extensively metabolized, as Vilazodone was. CYP3A4 and 5, CYP2C9 and 19, and CYP2D6. So like 5 different CYP enzymes. And here's the thing to remember about vortioxetine. Long half-life, 66 hours. So not as long as fluoxetine, but longer than anything else. So cariprazine is the other one that's long. Oh, I mean, that's an antipsychotic, but when I think about our long-acting psych drugs, I think about fluoxetine, I think about vortioxetine, and I think about cariprazine. And so then adverse effects, once again, similar to Vilazodone, nausea, vomiting, constipation, other serotonergic side effects. Vilazodone, I couldn't find a pregnancy category. This was given C back in the old days when they used to do it that way. And the new way is, there's not really a new way. But this C category type stuff is not really used that much anymore. Drug interactions. So this is the same as for Vilazodone. Strong inhibitors of 2D6 can increase its levels like bupropion. Strong inducers of CYP enzymes can decrease it like carbamazepine and phenytoin, and contraindicated with concurrent use of MIOI. And this is a difference with all of our other ones except fluoxetine. Fluoxetine was it 4 weeks or 5 weeks? All the other ones, it's 2 weeks. Fluoxetine, it's either 4 or 5. And with this one, it's 3. So contraindicated 3 weeks after stopping. So it's 2 weeks before, right? It's always 2 weeks before because that's the half-life of the MAOI's enzyme activation, right? But 3 weeks after stopping, 2 weeks after stopping an MAOI, you can start vortioxetine. But 3 weeks after stopping vortioxetine, because of its long half-life, can you start an MAOI? All right. And then once again, this protein binding doesn't seem to really have an impact on things like aspirin and warfarin. So let's go through the advantage and disadvantage list. Somewhat similar to Vilazodone, but I have less bad things to say about this one. So just to make the point, they claim to have improved cognitive ability, weight, and sexual dysfunction. I don't see the evidence for it. Okay. So I had mentioned before, fluoxetine was originally reported to have 1.8% adverse sexual effects. So and they're saying it's like 1% or something like that. Well, fluoxetine was 1.8% when it came out, and now it's like 70%. And so, your couple of trials that you did to get it approved is not enough data. It's not enough time. And I've looked into this, there's been no further research into this. All we have are the studies done by the drug company over a decade ago. It's not enough data. So it's not 1%. It's much higher. I can guarantee you that. And so and so it says it improves sexual dysfunction, but it also says improvements in weight. Where's that coming from? What thing about the way this med works would have less effect on weight than the other SSRIs? It's not affecting was it 2A or 2C? I get those two mixed up, but it doesn't have any like antagonism at one of those receptors or agonism or whatever would counteract what the SSRI was doing. So I'm not really seeing why that claim would be there. And then the cognitive ability, just because it's affecting 7, I talked about that. There's not good evidence for this. There's like the one study they did like 15 years ago and nothing since. And that's just versus placebo, right? Like, how do we know that it's better than the other SSRIs if there are no head-to-head trials of any kind next to them, right? So if you're going to claim it's better, you need to do like just doing it versus placebo and seeing what the percentage is and comparing that to, fluoxetine versus placebo 30 plus years ago, almost 40 years ago. You can't compare that. You have to compare them head to head, and it hasn't been done. So these are potential advantages, but they're advantages that I'm not really sold on. I think there might be a minuscule statistical significance here, but like not really any clinical significance. And, just to make clear what that means, a statistical significance, this word significance means something different when we say statistical significance. It just means that there is a statistical difference. That could mean that there is one point on a 60-point scale difference. And we definitely know it because we have so much good data and it's so clear and it's so concise. And, because sometimes if it's kind of fuzzy, foggy data, there's some overlap there. And so if there's only a 1 or 2 point difference, you may not be able to say it's statistically significant because there's like the confidence interval and the range of what that is kind of overlaps to where it's like, well, if we're overlapping our statistics there, then it's not actually that we can say that it's different. I'm not going to go into the huge depth in that. Most of you that are listening to this know about this sort of thing. But like if you have a really low p-value and you don't have your confidence interval overlapping and the difference is just 1, you can say that it's statistically significant. It could be a difference of 40 points or a difference of 1 point on a scale, and you still say exactly the same thing. You stay statistically significant. It doesn't, the word significant here doesn't mean that it's a big difference. I think what we think of as the word significant is a lot, a big difference. But statistical significance just means that there is a statistical difference, that we can say definitively based on this study that there is a difference. It may be completely undetectable by the patient, but it's there. And that's why I like to think more of clinical significance. Clinical significance is the patient notices the difference. They feel better or worse, right? Depending on what the difference was. And so I really could give a crap about statistical significance. It means nothing to me. If the patient doesn't notice a difference, then it's not there as far as I'm concerned. And even if they do notice a difference, if it's so small for like a massive price difference, it's probably not worth it. Okay. So, and then when you've got drug companies not doing enough studies to show whether there's clinical significance or not, it's like, how can you even make that call? And they can just, report statistical significance, and it sounds like it means something. And it could, but just saying something statistically significant, just saying that in and of itself, if we're dealing with something more scientific like chemicals and things like that, then that's more meaningful. But when we're dealing with subjective symptoms of, how clear am I thinking, how well do I feel, how well do I feel like I slept last night, a drug could have a statistically significant difference in sleep, that a patient, sleeps 10 minutes longer on this med versus, not taking it. But ask the patient, do you feel more alert during the day? And they're going to say no. That 10 minutes gave them absolutely nothing. Is it a difference? Yeah. Did the med do something? Yes. Did it do anything for our situation? No, it didn't help us at all. That 10 minutes was worthless, right? So that 1 point difference on a cognitive ability scale, or, I'd have to look at this exact study. I've looked at it before. It's like 1, 2, or 3 points on like a massive scale. I just can't imagine how anyone would notice the difference. So does it actually do something there? Yeah. But also, how do we know when some of our older meds don't? Because when they got approved, that wasn't even something they looked at. If we looked at that with those meds, if that was something that we looked at now, we might find that that same benefit was there, right? And that's why you have to do the head-to-head trial. You have to actually do a trial of this med versus this med. And then again, one trial that's done by the company who makes it is not really meaning anything to me. You can basically fake data without lying and without actually faking it, but you can like manipulate things to get the results you want in an overall honest way. And a lot of the time you don't even realize you're doing it. You want a certain result, and so you get it, but you don't realize you're actually being deceptive just because like you just had skin in the game, and that's you end up just getting that result. Because you use techniques that got you there, and you may not even be conscious of the fact that there was some bias in there. And so that's why you can't just listen to one study. We want to see lots of studies. We want to see big numbers. We want to see decades of studies over time showing us something. Just one thing that is versus placebo compared to something else versus placebo decades earlier, when the trials used different scales, they different patient populations, different techniques, different, lots of different differences. You can't compare those. You need one study showing both of those things at the same time. You can't compare the two trials that were done decades apart that use different information. This is the thing. It's so difficult to decipher all this, and who has time for it? Like, I'm trying to be of some benefit to help you guys, to tell you about this stuff. Without getting too much into the weeds, I don't want this podcast to be about me pulling up studies and reading information. and read, going, oh, here's this one, this means this, and this means this. I kind of want to give you a general overview of how I think and what studies I've read and generally what I've seen, and then, give you my interpretation. And, if you trust me, take it with what you want to take it for. Okay. So let's finish our advantages on vortioxetine. So one, these improved cognitive ability, weight gain or weight no weight change, weight neutral, and sexual dysfunction. It claims that these are better. I question it. It also doesn't affect the CYP enzymes, as vilazodone didn't. It's metabolized by multiple CYP enzymes, so might be less affected by inhibitors and inducers, except for bupropion. Bupropion increases its levels by 128%. So bupropion is not a great med to use with vortioxetine or vilazodone, and I'd say not a great one to use with fluoxetine either. So I would not give bupropion with one of our 2D6 medications. That's why it's escitalopram and citalopram are two good options for bupropion, because they don't use 2D6. So when you're combining bupropion, it's best to combine them with one that's not affected by 2D6, because then the levels get all janky. And that may just mean that you want to dose that med at about half what you normally would have dosed it, right? So if I'm going to give them, say, vilazodone, maybe I give them the 20 milligram dose instead of the 40 milligram dose, something like that. Okay. So the advantage there was that it's not that affected by meds. However, it is affected by bupropion, and bupropion is a med that we frequently combine with the serotonergic medications. And so this is another problem. You put them on vortioxetine, it makes it a little more challenging to give them bupropion. And like I said, we often add bupropion. It makes it a little harder to add it to this particular med. All right, next positive point. Reportedly, it's tolerated the best. And this is, I've seen this in a meta-analysis, and I'm going to report this at some point. But when you look at the dropout rates of people taking antidepressants, and what a dropout rate is in a study, like how many patients quit the study because they didn't want to take the med anymore because they didn't like the side effects. Dropout rate with vortioxetine is actually lower than any of the other antidepressants in this meta-analysis I looked at, which compared like 10 or 15 meds. So that's good. Often what comes with being the best tolerated is the lowest effectiveness, and that's what you see. Vortioxetine has one of the lowest effect sizes. So it just doesn't do as much. It doesn't cause as much adverse effects, but it also doesn't cause as much positive effects. But it is relatively well tolerated. And if you remember, vilazodone has more GI upset. So far, vortioxetine is beating vilazodone. All right. There's only one point that I pick vilazodone on, and that's cost. Vilazodone is off patent. Vortioxetine isn't. If I'm not worried about cost, I'm going to pick vortioxetine if I'm picking between these two. But if I'm taking cost into consideration, then that becomes an issue. And I'm not necessarily going to pick vilazodone over vortioxetine. I'm probably going to pick one of a handful of other meds. But it does have the lowest dropout rates. That's a good effect. Next, it has that long half-life. And that's good for compliance and for not getting withdrawal. So next to fluoxetine, and fluoxetine we know has the 2D6 inhibition that we don't like, vortioxetine doesn't affect the CYP enzymes. And so having that long half-life gives us that benefit that fluoxetine had without the downside of the CYP inhibitions. And then the other upside is vortioxetine has the 5-HT3 blockade, which might help with the adverse effects of nausea and other GI adverse effects. So I would say that I'm not hating vortioxetine. Vilazodone, I just don't see a reason for vilazodone. I think that was just a miss. But vortioxetine, we've got, lowest dropout rates, so best tolerated. We've got the long half-life, which is often a good thing. And I mean, that's good because, patients don't take their medication. They skip a day here and there. Um, we're going to have less effect from that. And then the whole withdrawal, if they stop the med being less, that's great. And then generally these serotonin receptors that vortioxetine blocks or agonizes um, give decent effects. The blockade of 5-HT3 and 7, I mean, even if it's barely a difference, it's something. It's better than not doing it, perhaps. So I see that as kind of a positive thing. And does it have less sexual dysfunction? I think it has less. I think what I saw was that it was like 44%. And so that's versus the 70 or so percent that the other ones have. So it still has it, but a little bit less. GI side effects, I think, is 30 with most meds. With this one, maybe it's 10 or 20, right? So a little bit better. So I would say that there's some decent advantages for this medication. What are the disadvantages? All in all, it's basically just another SSRI, and it's got the effect size is about the same as the other meds, and actually on the lower end. Effect size is 0.28. That's not a good effect size. Generally, less than 0.3 is not much of anything. And I'm gonna go through all the effect sizes for all the medications after we finish going through all the antidepressants, but it does have one of the lowest effect sizes. So it's basically just another SSRI with a mediocre effect size that's actually even on the low end compared to the other meds that came before it. All right. And then, as I said, all those advantages or not all of them, but most of the advantages I listed are just from trials done by the drug company itself. And, this is a med that's not widely used. The trials are almost all limited to those that were done to approve the meds. So not even necessarily trials done by the drug company after it was released. What we're seeing with these GLP-1 medications that I love so much for weight loss, trials are coming out after the drugs were approved, showing benefits, cardiac benefits, renal benefits. We just saw that Zepbound was approved for sleep apnea, right? Cognitive improvements. Longer, there's like this 52-week, this 80-week studies coming out. So like they're doing like subsequent studies after the drugs have been approved that are showing these additional benefits. That's a good sign to me. There hasn't been a single trial about vortioxetine since it was approved. Those approval trials are just there to get the drug approved. And all you have to show is that it's safe and it works. That's it. You don't have to show how good it is. All you have to do is show that it works and it's safe. And the FDA will approve it, right? So you don't necessarily have to show other things. As long as it works as well as what else is out there, and it does, and that it doesn't have some sort of horrible adverse effects that would make it dangerous and unnecessary because we have so many other treatments. If we had no other treatments, the FDA would be more likely to approve something that had some risk that we would have to mediate. But if we have other options that are equal effectiveness, they're not going to approve something that's more dangerous than what else is out there. So basically, vortioxetine, it's like, oh, this works as well as everything else, and it doesn't have any huge red flags. We'll approve it. But what's my reason to use it, right? Like convince me why I should use this instead of the other antidepressants. There's just not a great argument for it. I think that if it weren't on patent, like there's some subtle things. I think, like I said, the 5-HT3 blockade, the 5-HT7 blockade, the 1A agonism, those are intriguing. They're intriguing, but like there's no real evidence that they do anything. Okay. And that's not to say that there isn't. And perhaps there's studies that were out there that were done that didn't show a difference and they just didn't get published. Perhaps nothing's been done. People just aren't really looking at, they're not prescribing this med. Once again, this is not in the top 300 meds. This is not something, this was kind of a bust of a medication. I think that I think Vilazodone and Vortioxetine, they came out in 2012, 2013 with these kind of promises that, hey, this is just as good as your SSRIs, but they don't have all the adverse effects. And then I think, they were probably used a little bit and folks kind of saw, you know what, they're not really that much better. The adverse effects are pretty much the same as they are for the other ones. And theoretically, they have these different mechanisms of action, so maybe they should work differently, but they're just not really cutting the mustard. And so they are not really prescribed that much anymore. And Vilazodone, maybe it's on your radar a little bit because it's off patent now. And, if it's not more expensive, hey, why not? But like I said, it's got some stuff about it with the food and the 3A4 that make me think, I don't even want to mess with this med. Vortioxetine is a med that if it costs about the same as everything else, and there's this hint that it might be a tiny bit better, well, maybe I would use it. But if it's a branded product, if you're going to try and convince me to use a branded product over something that's tons cheaper and generic, you need to be substantially better. You need to have something where it's like, this doesn't do this thing this other thing does. Not it maybe a little bit less does it. Right? So I want to be a good steward of our healthcare system. And since there's not really any clear evidence that this is just like substantially clinically better than anything else, and it costs a lot more and will for like at least another 5 years or so, it's just not something that I'm going to consider. And so I think, Vilazodone, I just, like I said, don't care for it at all. Vortioxetine, maybe I'd be a little bit piqued thinking about it. And I think maybe if I had that patient that had that chronic GI upset but benefited from the SSRI, maybe that's the patient that I would pull the plug on, or not the plug. I would pull the lever on and say, hey, why don't we try Vortioxetine? I actually almost had a patient like that a couple of years ago, and then for whatever reason, there wasn't I went a different direction with it. But yeah, there was that one patient that I almost did it for, and I think they're probably out there. Person that I might give Vortioxetine to, you might be out there, but I'm just really not thinking about it. So that wraps up the serotonin modulators and stimulators. Not an exciting episode as far as, hey, this is, great, but, they're out there. And when I think about them, when I wouldn't, for completeness sake, let's talk about Vilazodone and Vortioxetine, and probably don't need to talk about them again. Next episode, we're going to go through the much newer medications, the NMDA receptor antagonists. We'll talk about ketamine, S-ketamine, and we're going to talk about Auvelity. So I think that will be that. We've finally gotten to meds that work a lot different than the ones we previously discussed. So this will be interesting. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned a lot. And please rate the show and tell people if you like it. And I will see you next time.